In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that we can manage our OTLs in Houdini. Now, over here on the right, I have a scene that was just sort of opened fresh, and I just copied a camera in here. And this is meant to represent a hip file that we created in some other shot. And then over here on the left, I have just my original hip file where we created the emitter OTL in the first place. So we said that one of the purposes of OTLs is to be able to just create a setup and propagate it out to hip files and a whole bunch of shots. So what we'd expect based on that is that we just created this hip file and we'd be able to just create our create emitter OTL. So let's just go to the tab menu, and it's not there. And the reason for this is that Houdini will pick up OTLs that are saved into a particular place on disk, which is defined by an environment variable. And we'll be looking at how to manage that later in this course. But for now, I want to just show you how to deal with it manually. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and install our create emitter OTL. And we can do that from the assets menu. Now notice there are quite a few options in here that allow us to deal with digital assets in various ways. We're going to be looking at the most common ones that you'll use in production. First, let's take a look at install asset library. This just brings up a dialog that lets us find an OTL file on disk. And the way this is going to work is we're going to basically tell Houdini, hey, there's this OTL file somewhere, and even though it's not part of your scan path, I want to use it in this hip file. And Houdini's going to say, cool, I'll just save that OTL path into the hip file so that if you ever launch this hip file again, the OTL will still be installed. So that's basically what we're doing here. We can use the file picker to just pick a file. And of course, Houdini doesn't update because I didn't actually change the path here. So let me just go ahead and change it. And once this happens and you've chosen an OTL file, it will show you what digital assets are actually contained inside that file. In this case, we have an object level one called create emitter v01, which is the one that we want. So let's just go ahead and hit install. And now if we look at our tab menu and type create, we have create emitter v01, which is what we want. And we can go ahead and just plug it into our camera and we get our happy emitter here. So what if that's pretty cool, but we're going to be posting this to a forum or something on the internet, and we would really like to not have to include a whole bunch of loose files all over everywhere. We can actually handle that by just going to our type properties. And where it says save to library, we can just tell it embedded. This has to be with a capital E, it has to be spelled correctly. And it's basically just a keyword that you just have to know exists. And this will tell Houdini, take this OTL and make it part of the hip file. Now, notice this is a bit of a distinction from what we did before with the install asset library option. What that did was only save a path to the OTL file on disk into the hip file. This is going to save the entire OTL definition into the hip file, which means if I hit accept, of course, it wants me to unlock the OTL so it can save it. If I middle click here, you can see that it's saved it to a library called embedded. And that means that if we give someone this hip file, even if they don't have the OTL file on disk, they can still use the definition in this hip file. Now, note that these embedded OTLs are kind of dangerous because what we're doing is removing some of the purpose of OTLs on our end. Basically, what we're saying is the definition of the OTL is now embedded into our hip file. So that means that if we update the OTL somewhere else, we can't pick it up because we're not pointing to a file on disk that might have been updated from some other hip file. We're pointing to a definition that's embedded into this hip file and only this hip file. So generally speaking, I recommend against using embedded OTLs for any kind of production purpose, and only using them if wrapping everything up into a neat bow to distribute easily, like, for example, as I said before, on an internet forum, is the most important thing. Okay, so what if we want to just get rid of this embedded OTL in our file? Well, there is a good way to do this, but it's a little bit dangerous with how we've set it up here. And I'm going to show you how to break your HIP file, and then I'm going to show you how to fix it. So if we go to our Assets menu, we can go to another option called Asset Manager. And this will show us a list of all of the OTLs and compiled plugins that are currently connected to our Houdini session. These are ones that live in scanned file locations. You can see all of these nice Houdini default ones. And if we go to current HIP file, we can see that we have our original create emitter file, and we have this embedded one. And if we just expand the file on disk or embedded, we can see all of the digital assets that are defined by that library. Let's see if I can expand this one. It shows that one. Notice that this one's in red, which means that this one's actually not being used. It's just that Houdini saved this path into the HIP file, as we said before. And it's still saved there, so it still knows that there's a create emitter OTL defined by this path, but it's not actually using it currently. It's using the one from embedded. So what happens if we just select the one from embedded and hit delete? Houdini will remove the embedded library from our HIP file by doing that. So let's just go ahead and hit OK. And now it's highlighted this one in white. And now if we click on this, it just bumped to the path on disk because that's the other thing that's defining that type. So what if we go ahead and uninstall this one as well? So just highlight it and press delete. Now note that when we're doing this, when it's saved on disk, we have to be a little bit careful. Because if we highlight the file on disk and hit delete, Houdini is just going to remove the path from our Houdini session, which is kind of what we want here. But if we select the node type that is being defined by the file on disk, it will actually delete the OTL off of disk. So generally speaking, I prefer to just always select the file on disk, and if I want to delete the OTL itself, I'll just delete it using the file system because I find that a little bit safer. But if you want to do it on purpose, you can delete the OTL itself here. So if we select this and hit delete, Houdini asks us for confirmation, and of course it will let us do it. It gives us a little bit of an error. And notice we have a warning flag here. And if I just middle click here, Houdini says it's using an incomplete asset definition, and notice that we're back to being defined by embedded. So you might think, oh, okay, so we just removed the path from the HIP file, so Houdini can't find it anymore, so it just embedded the OTL like we did through the type properties dialog. That's not quite what happened. Notice that before we didn't have this warning saying it was using an incomplete asset definition, and if we dive inside, all of our nodes are here, but what happens if we match current definition and then dive inside? All the nodes are gone. That's pretty scary. What happened here is that Houdini no longer could find this definition anywhere, and so it replaced it with what's called a dummy definition. And dummy definitions are kind of your worst enemy in some ways. But they're pretty easy to fix. All we have to do is just go to Assets, install Asset Library, and reinstall our asset from on disk. And we're back in business. Just be very careful not to modify dummy definitions and then save over your OTL file on disk. Okay, so this is pretty cool. But what if we put our emitter into a whole bunch of different shots, and we realized that sometimes the camera changes, but we didn't actually want the emitter itself to change? And what we'd like to be able to do is say, okay, we've got an improved look in the shot. Let's just lock off the emitter so that even if the camera changes and we update it for some other reason, our emitter doesn't actually change. So we're going to go ahead and add the ability to do that to our OTL. When we make these kinds of big changes to our OTLs, a lot of times it's a good idea to version up. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. I'm going to show you the most brute force simple way, which is to just go ahead and copy the OTL definition and change this number from v01 to v02. So if we go to Assets, and we go back to our Asset Manager, expand current HIP file, And notice that that dummy definition is still there under embedded. I'm just going to select it and hit delete to keep my hip file nice and clean. I'm going to expand the type names from the OTL path. Just go ahead and right click on it and say copy, which brings up something kind of similar to the dialog that we got when we first created our OTL. It just wants to know what the type name, what the label is, and where to save it. So we're just going to version up to version 2. And we'll just save it to version 2 on disk as well. And hit accept. And you can see here in the asset manager that it created a version 2 of our OTL. And it created a version 2 type as well. So now if we hit close and we go to our tab menu and say create emitter, we see a version 2. We can put it down. So I'm just going to delete my version 1, and we're going to make some changes to version 2. And while we're at it, we'll just come back over here to our original shot maybe, and we want to go ahead and up version one of these OTLs. So let's just go ahead and click on this one and say right click. And we could just delete it and create a version 2 as well, but what if we have a bunch of changes on our parameters that we'd like to keep? So a cool way to deal with that is under actions, we can just say change type. Now, of course, we'll need to install our version 2 OTL first. So I'll just go to assets, install asset library, and install version 2. And now when I right click and go to actions, I can say change type. And it just wants to know what node type to put. You can also tell it to keep the parameters, which is what we said before. We just want to keep any changes that we've made on the interface. And to keep the name, which usually we want. I don't know why it's off by default, because you almost always do want that. Now if we click on this, we should be able to find our create emitter version 2, which is here. And if we just hit accept, we get a create emitter version 2, which we can see is defined by the new type. So now if we go over here, and we're going to just go ahead and add our save to disk option, which is the way that we're going to go ahead and lock it off. I'm going to just right click and say allow editing of contents. We can dive inside, go into the create emitter node. And just at the very bottom, we can just say ROP geometry output, just to do something really quick. And then maybe we're going to say that people have to write it out in order to proceed, so that they always have a backup in case the camera changes and they update it for some other reason. So it's basically a way to prevent users from accidentally making mistakes. So we're just going to have a file stop. And that's going to be our output. And I'm just going to go to the ROP geometry, right click on output file, copy parameter, go to the file stop, right click on geometry file, and paste relative references. And of course it's erroring because that file doesn't exist. So we're going to just go ahead and give it some name that makes sense. I'm just going to make it relative to the hip file for now, because that's just simpler. Let's just say emitter. And I'm going to go ahead and save it to disk just to make sure it works. And yes, so our file stop ROP geometry combo is working. Just put the ROP geometry here. And now we need to create our OTL interface. So if we just come back up to object level, right click on our OTL, let's say type properties. And then I'm just going to go to from nodes and expand out to our ROP geometry and just promote save to disk. And I'm actually going to promote the output file parameter. Normally, I don't like to do this. And the reason for that is that I don't think users should necessarily care where they're writing the geometry to. The tool should be able to just generate a path and know what to do. And then the user only cares what version of that geometry they're picking up. But for the purposes of this example, I don't want to go over how to create version parameters and things of that sort. So I'm just going to go ahead and promote the output file parameter directly, and then the user can decide where they want to save it to and then read it back in from. And let's just go ahead and hit apply. This looks a bit ugly. It's kind of annoying because we have some grouping of parameters here that seems to be related to creating the actual emitter itself, and then a couple of other parameters that are just related to saving to disk. And they're not really related to each other, but they're all just kind of jammed together on the interface, which is a little bit confusing and also kind of ugly. So what I'm going to do is just go back to by type and say folder. And let's just add 2 folders here. Let's grab our emitter parameters and just drag them onto our top folder here. And grab our disk parameters and drag them onto our bottom folder so that they're inside it. And we'll just call the top folder emitter settings, and the bottom folder output settings. And hit apply. And in fact, I'm just going to cancel to get rid of that. And even though when I hit apply, it saved it, I just have a habit of always doing save node type before I do match current definition. So I'm going to do that now. And now we have our interface that allows us to save to disk. So now let's say that we've done this over here in our other shot, and we want to go back to our original shot and apply our changes. And it's easy enough. Houdini has just picked up the changes that we made over here. Now, sometimes it doesn't actually pick up these changes. So if that happens, you can just go to Assets, Refresh Asset Libraries. And Houdini will go ahead and pick up those changes to the interface and inside the OTL itself. And now we can go here and say, save to disk, and it'll save out our nice emitter. In this video, we looked at some of the basics of managing our OTLs by hand in Houdini. In future videos, we will look at how to decide where to save our OTLs on disk so that Houdini will automatically pick them up. And we'll start looking at how to actually create OTLs out of a production system.